Dr. Amit Goswami is a theoretical nuclear physicist. He taught physics at the University of Oregon for 32 years and is on the advisory board of the Institute of Noetic Sciences. He was interviewed in the hit movie What the Bleep Do We Know? And was featured in another movie, Dalai Lama Renaissance. Dr. Goswami is the author of many popular books on quantum physics. He recently talked at East West Books in Mountain View about his latest book, God is Not Dead. And afterward, he agreed to give me a private interview in which he talked about monistic idealism, in which consciousness, not matter, is the ground of all being and the basis of the major religions. Dr. Goswami, many people today have a naive interpretation of God. They conceive of God as being an emperor on a throne in the sky, and then set up that straw God and then refute it. So how has your work dealt with this problem?
This is a general problem about bringing the new scientific view in the forefront of popular opinion. The problem is that this God has been discarded by generally philosophers and scientists alike, most educated people, at least a century ago. So this is really not the issue anymore. Unfortunately, by the advent of scientific materialism, which is the idea that everything is made of matter, that some scientists are pushing very hard since 1950s, religions have been pushed to a corner. Fundamentalists have grown in not only America, but in other countries as well. Some of the effects we are seeing in the form of terrorism as extreme as that. But when this happens, very primitive pictures of God come back to the forefront. So the more materialism pushes on these people to give up their belief system and accept one which is selfish and negative and hedonistic, the more these people tend to believe in a God which is very simplistic of the olden days, forgetting some of the reasons that we have to give up on such a God. So is God like that? No. The God that science is rediscovering for the past couple of decades is very different. It has to be compatible with science, of course. So it is a very scientific God, but at the same time does retain the most important part of all spiritual traditions. In fact, these people that I just called fearful and fundamentalist because they are being pushed, if you put a God that satisfies the three criterions I'll now mention, even they will basically be satisfied. They may not be satisfied with the details, but everyone who is spiritually minded, religious minded, supports these three notions connected with God and spirituality. The first is, apart from material causation, there is another source of causality in the world. This is the source that is called God. Material causation is called upward causation because cause rises from elementary particles upward to atoms, to molecules, to cells, to brain. This new source of causation, new old, because this is also very old, in the religious traditions, spiritual traditions are given various names, but I will use the phrase downward causation for it to nicely contrast it from upward causation.
Before you do, could you tell us what upward causation is?
Upward causation is that idea that cause rises upward from elementary particles to more and more complex conglomerates of elementary particles.
From elements to atoms?
Elementary particles to atoms, to molecules, to cells, to brain eventually.
Then to consciousness.
And then consciousness is just a brain phenomenon.
An epiphenomenon of matter.
Epiphenomenon of the brain.
Right.
It has no causal efficacy apart from the causal efficacy of the elementary particles and their interactions.
Right.
So that becomes the basis of scientific materialism. And spiritual traditions say that no, there is another source of causality, another source of causal power, and this source is what they call God, basically.
And this is in sync with the perennial philosophy.
This is in sync with the perennial philosophy as well, and this is also in sync with what science is rediscovering. We are finding that without downward causation, we cannot explain many, many scientific paradoxes and anomalies.
So if we can put it this way, where does downward causation originate?
Downward causation in the new view originates from a higher state of our own consciousness, a non-ordinary state of our own consciousness. And here is where quantum physics plays a very major role. How does downward causation, how is it exerted? Quantum physics says that material objects are possibilities. They are not determined things that Newton thought they were. They are actually possibilities. Now, these possibilities, it is a fact that these possibilities, whenever we look at them, they become actual things of our experience. A little more sophisticated way of putting this is that quantum physics predicts waves of possibility, but whenever we look, they look like particle in our experience. So how does the wave become a particle? This becomes a paradox in the materialist way of thinking, because in material way of thinking, possible elementary particles making possible atoms, making possible molecules, making possible cells, making possible brain, making possible consciousness, and this possible consciousness looking at possible particles, possible objects, possible elementary particles, cannot possibly give you any actuality, right? So actuality becomes impossible in this way of looking at things. How does actuality arrive then? So the idea is that it is the looking by a non-material consciousness that is converting possibility into actuality. Consciousness have to be non-material. We must have a non-material component within us. We have a material body, no doubt, but there must also be a non-material consciousness. Unfortunately, scientists see a paradox in that also, and scientists are right. The paradox is the kind of thinking that we are now doing is again dualism, very close to what how Descartes posited the mind and matter dualism. And ever since Descartes, we have known that this is a major weakness of that view, which is that how does a non-material mind, non-material consciousness interact with matter? They have nothing in common, so they need a mediator to interact. But any mediator will have to use a signal containing energy. So energy has to go out of the material world into another world, or energy has to come back from another world to material world. But any of these effects are never seen. The energy of the material world itself is always a constant in any process. It never goes out of material world, never comes into the material world from any other world. So this law of energy conservation is violated in any kind of dualistic thinking, and this is why dualistic thinking is not scientific. So this was a major problem of accepting this consciousness solution of how quantum possibilities are converted to actual events of experience, which was first proposed by John von Neumann, a great scientist.
What is some of the most striking evidence for downward causation?
The most striking evidence for downward causation comes from the quantum signatures of downward causation. Downward causation comes with such signatures that they can never be forged by material interaction. Well, let me give you an example. Downward causation is non-local, does not require signals for communication. And non-locality is something that material interaction can never simulate. Therefore, if I find evidence for non-locality in our dealings with each other, then materialist science can never refute downward causation again, because there is no materialist way of understanding this phenomenon. And this is why materialists tooth and nail fight the ideas that they label as parapsychology, because parapsychologists are people who try to find evidence for non-local communications among those that are labeled as psychics. Now, many work involving psychics have been done, and of course scientists try to refute these works because they involve thoughts, and we can never be sure of thoughts thoughts are not materially measurable in certain sense. So this aspect of parapsychology is bogged down into controversy. But there are, however, experiments that started with Jacobo Greenberg at the University of Mexico, who read my work about consciousness is the ground of being, and read the conclusion that the conscious choice takes place at a deep level where we are one. There is a fundamental non-locality of our consciousness at a deeper level. When he saw that, he theorized that there should be a way of verifying this idea that consciousness is non-local. We share consciousness with others. He asked two people to meditate together, and these people are not psychics, so you cannot label them. They're just ordinary people. They meditate together for 20 minutes with the idea that they will have direct communication, non-local signal-less communication. After meditating for 20 minutes, they are told to hold the intention of non-local communication, but they are separated and put in independent Faraday chambers. These are electromagnetically impervious chambers. No electromagnetic wave can go through them. So there is no electromagnetic connection anymore between these two observers. Basically, any signal connection has been eliminated this way. So now their brains individually are connected to individual electroencephalogram EEG machines. And now one subject and one subject only is shown a series of light flashes. This subject brain becomes active in the occipital area, and that is what is then measured by the EEG connected to this brain. From the EEG recordings, the noise can be eliminated and the signal is extracted. That signal is called an evoked potential. Now, one also looks at the brain waves recorded by the EEG machine connected to the second subject's brain, who has not seen any light flashes. And when one eliminates noise from this recording of the EEG of the second subject, the astounding thing is that the signal one gets is so close in strength and phase with the first signal, with the evoked potential, that the researchers were forced to say that this is a transferred potential. In other words, electric potential has been transferred from one brain to another without any electrical connection. How is that possible? This is not ordinary telepathy. This is not just a transfer of thought, and therefore you can always create controversies about talking about thoughts. This is actual electric potential transferred from one brain to another, but without any electrical connection. Because control subjects who don't meditate together or who cannot hold the intention, for them there is no transfer potential. That has been checked out. There is no transfer potential. The electrical activity is very small compared to the evoked potential that was evoked by the light signals. So something special happens when you meditate together with the intention that you will become one, you will become non-locally connected. Are you non-locally connected? Yes, you are, because your brain is picking up electric potential from another brain with whom you have been connected, although you are not seeing the light flashes. But consciousness chooses out of the possibilities in your brain that particular state which corresponds to looking at light flashes anyway. And this is because you are connected in consciousness with your correlated partner. So this is one of the major evidence. And this is an evidence that supports non-locality, cannot be simulated by material interactions. So very good evidence for downward causation, which is here to stay. This experiment of Jacobo Greenberg at the University of Mexico has now been replicated at the University of, in London by Peter Fenwick and his collaborators, by a researcher named Wackerman, and then finally at 2004 in Bastille University by Liana Standish and her collaborators, all 4 experiments, independent experiments, 4 different research groups, 4 different laboratories, replicating the same basic data, that electric potential can be transferred from one brain to another by virtue of a meditative correlation. This is vintage data in favor of downward causation and by inference about a causal agency called God. There is another type of evidence that also is worthwhile discussing, which supports another quantum principle. This is the principle of discontinuity. In quantum physics, as Niels Bohr discovered in 1913, as early as that, quantum physics is another very, very interesting property that cannot be simulated by material interactions. In quantum physics, objects have 2 kinds of movement. One is continuous, but the other kind of movement is discontinuous. This discontinuous movement shows up when electrons jump from one atomic orbit to another without going through the intervening space. Discontinuity of movement. Now, this discontinuity of movement, which is impossible to simulate with material interactions, shows up also in the phenomenon of creativity. Our creative experiences, which occur in the realm of thought. In our creative experiences, we find ourselves thinking of something that is so totally new that we have never thought that before. So here is one thought, and then there is no intermediate thought, and we get into a completely new thought. This is why creative experiences are called aha experiences. They come with a surprise. We have never thought this before, and yet we are thinking this now. Just like the electron's quantum leap from one atomic orbit to another without going through the intervening space, from the old thought, we have gone into a new thought without any intermediate step-by-step thoughts. This is creativity. Okay, if you say creativity is in this way a subjective experience, creativity shows up in a very objective case of biological evolution. Biological evolution does not entirely follow the dictates of Darwin's theory. This is an open secret that biologists have discovered for quite some time. The fossil data has large gaps in it. What is the explanation of these fossil gaps? The explanation is that there are 2 tempos in evolution. One tempo is the slow tempo, which Darwinism can explain. But another tempo is fast tempo. The evolution happens so fast that there is no time to lay down fossils. But how to give an explanation of this fast tempo? Is there a mechanism? Quantum physics is providing the mechanism as quantum leap of creativity, biological creativity. So there is even objective data in favor of discontinuous transition. Another type of objective data in favor of discontinuity shows up in healing. Deepak Chopra has popularized this as quantum healing. The fact is, overnight, serious physical defects like a cancer can disappear. In a spontaneous healing, which does not involve any intermediate steps or even any medical intervention at all. Just spontaneously people heal their cancers. Here is the cancer, it disappeared. And this kind of thing can be explained also as quantum leaps of healing. Downward causation is the most important aspect of spirituality that we are rediscovering within our science. There's a second aspect of spirituality, which is the subtle bodies. Apart from the material bodies, we have subtle bodies. The subtle bodies are the vital energy body, mind, even a supramental archetypal body that we intuit. There is good evidence for the subtle bodies as well. And then there is a third aspect of spirituality that we must consider, which is, again, agreed upon by all spiritual traditions, all religions, which is that we should try to be good. We should try to love each other. We should pursue these supramental archetypes and manifest them in our lives, which is developing virtue, which is practically every religion tells us to aspire to. In fact, this has been the one place where religion has played a very important role in our societies. And science, materialist science, by undermining religion as a whole, has also undermined these values and virtues, their role in our society, and that is causing probably the most confusing aspects of our current society, such as global warming, such as breakdown of democracy and capitalism, such as terrorism, because values really are under attack from materialist science.
You have actually called yourself a quantum activist. Could you talk to us about this?
So I have become a quantum activist because of this affront of scientific materialism to our society. If this value erosion continues, obviously society cannot function. Already we are seeing some of the evidence, some of the beginnings, rumblings of that. Terrorism, for example. Greed gone so rampant that capitalism is no longer working. And these are just a couple of examples. There are so many more. So what I'm saying is that quantum physics, if we heed to the principles of quantum physics, we can pick up hints of how to change ourselves and our society, bring it back to ethics and values once again. So what is quantum activism? Quantum activism is activism which helps us to change ourselves and our society using the basic principles of quantum physics. What are some of these basic principles? One principle is quantum non-locality. Non-locality means signal-less communication. The idea is that we share with every sentient being a non-local consciousness. Consciousness is the same for all of us. It's a cosmic consciousness. This cosmic nature of consciousness implies that I have an imperative to be good to my fellow sentient beings because we are one at some non-ordinary state of consciousness. We really are one. You and I are not separate ultimately. And therefore your good would do me good also. This ethics is inborn in quantum thinking, cannot be excluded from the way we live. And this is just one example of how quantum principles enables us to reestablish living within values and virtues.
In your book, Physics of the Soul, you talk about the near-death experience and how the near-death experience has some resonance with non-local consciousness because people apparently leave their bodies and are able to see things in other rooms that they wouldn't normally be able to see. Talk to us about this in the context of quantum physics.
Yes, this is a good, solid evidence in favor of quantum aspect of non-locality, for example. in experiences that are called autoscopic viewing, typically a person of cardiac arrest who will be declared dead only to be revived later because of the marvel of modern medicine. The experience that the person would have during the time he or she was clinically dead was typically that he would feel himself hovering above his physical body. And he or she would see surgery performed on this physical body, even be able to describe such gaudy details of surgery that it would be truly impossible to rule out that they are describing just from their general knowledge of what might happen in a room where surgery is being performed. In other words, there are just uncanny details specific to that particular operation rather than just generic aspects of heart.
How is it possible to see without eyes?
That's exactly the point. So that's why it's non-locality. So they are not seeing using their own eyes. They are seeing through the eyes of other people, like the surgeon, like the nurses, with whom they have become correlated.
And there are some instances where people feel they're actually very close to the ceiling looking down. In that instance, they would not have access to other people's eyes. So how would you explain that?
Well, it is happening non-locally. So they don't need to, obviously they are not seeing anything with their own eyes. They are clinically dead, remember?
Right.
So they are using other people's eyes. It's non-local seeing. It's non-local seeing, and more than that, this seeing is only in possibility until the possibility is becoming actual event, only after they are revived. Until then, the possibility is remaining in possibility, and only after they are revived, the whole bunch of possibilities in an entire chain of causal events become actualized. This is called delayed choice in quantum physics. They choose actuality from possibility only after they are revived, but that current state comes about because of a series of causal states before, and all of the causal states are actualized in the same fail soup.
In your book, Physics of the Soul, you talk about the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the processes that, what do you call it, the soul goes through. Would you talk to us about this?
It is indeed very much like the soul's journey can be described very much like going through the bardos, what Tibetans call bardos, which means doorways. And it's uncanny resemblance, because indeed Tibetans give us three bardos after death, three bardos in life, and three bardos of death. At death, and then that is called the fourth bardo experience, immediately after death, and then there is a fifth bardo, and the sixth bardo is when they reincarnate. Now the fourth bardo is the bardo of clear light, where it is described in the Tibetan Book of the Dead that you see clear light. If you can't see clear light, then you are liberated from this death, birth, reincarnation cycle.
What does clear light have to do with liberation from the material world?
Well, the clear light obviously means light here is consciousness. So you are encountering your true nature, which is consciousness as the ground of being, non-locality of consciousness. And at that moment, because you are liberated from all the conditioning of that birth brings and growing up means, and your identity with the brain and body and all that is gone. So you are free at that point if you can identify it, if you are conscious enough to recognize. That's the idea anyway. And then the next bardo, you have a choice. Either you can be free by seeing the light has become somewhat dim, but even then, if you can see it, then you can be free. Or if you don't see it, then you move on to the sixth bardo, where there is no such choice. You are reincarnated without any going back. This is the idea.
Can we see this light in this life.
Yes, we can see this light in this life, and then that sort of is the cinch, because that shows that this is not imaginations. Because the question can be raised: how do you know about death without having died? But that is ruled out by the fact that yes, we can experience these things even within this life. We just in this life we come back to life, but these are experiences of that people call samadhi experience. We become part of that non-ordinary state of consciousness in which we are one, in which state such vision that we are entering a consciousness that consists of light often does take place. It also can take place with other kinds of vision, but that is one of the visions that does take place in a experience of samadhi, of that non-ordinary state of consciousness in which we are one.
I think in a near-death experience, when people go so far as to see the light, their lives change. If they come back to life, they are selfless. They are more giving. Also, when someone has the experience of light in this life,
same things happen.
The
Same kind of transformation can take place. It's not automatic completely. One still has to manifest what one feels one must manifest. So what happens to the near-death survivors, if they have seen the clear light state and then have returned to their bodies, what happens is that they become inspired to live life differently. Because they have experienced life differently, they can practice easy without effort, things that previously took much more effort. So in that way, they make brain circuits that help them guide in their behavior in the future. And so we see them as transformed beings. The same choice is open to those people who has a samadhi experience. They too have an insight that we are one with others, and we can live ethically, love everybody, and often they do that. And because relatively less effort is involved, they become successful in making such brain circuits of behavior.
How is it that the Tibetan Book of the Dead is possible if it requires an experience of death in order to communicate what has happened?
Well, this is where some confusions occur, because after death, you cannot communicate. Obviously, communication is out. But what is missed is that there is an event of collapse, this change of possibility into actuality at the moment of birth.
You mean reincarnation?
When reincarnation has taken place. And only when reincarnation is taken place, only then we can talk about the sixth bardo that was missed, the fifth bardo that was missed, and the sixth bardo that was entered. So again, you see the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the intuition that these first two bardos has been missed, that intuition, it's an intuition. It's the intuition occurred the moment of birth, which is then latent in the person and later on can be revived with skillful remembering of the birth experience.
So is the intuition of what happened the same as memory?
No, because these are missed opportunities that didn't happen. Mm-hmm. So they're just intuitions. But what is not intuition is what did happen, and those happenings are also described as the sixth bardo experience. The fourth bardo and the fifth bardo, the clear light and the dim light, they are not experienced, because if they were experienced, then the person is free. You see what is happening?
Right.
So we can only
if they were free, they wouldn't be able to come back to report it.
There is nobody to come back to report it, or nobody reincarnated, so there is nobody to come back to report it. But how we can intuit about them, because this memories of intuition that I have missed something is there. That's an intuition. At the moment of the birth, that intuition would come. And the experiences, by the way, are very interesting. The experiences of the before one is born, there are experiences, for example, of heaven and hell. This is how the heaven and hell stories become so prominent in not only Tibetan Book of the Dead, but virtually every religion. Where do we get these pictures? These pictures we get because we again remember that as part of that moment of collapse at the birth, part of that, because, and they can be said to be memories. They are kind of a memories that, because in retrospect, they actually happen.
What actually happens to people that would cause them to have an experience of hell? For example, I know that when some people take psychedelic drugs, you can have a bad experience, and oftentimes these bad experiences, these bad trips, are caused because the ego cannot let go. When the ego wants to hold on, that is almost a guarantee of a bad experience.
Yeah, it's certain things that are in the memory. They become part of the possibility wave that the brain goes through. These are I shouldn't say brain. For the near-death experience, it's the brain. For ordinary living person, it's the brain. But for the dead person, there is no brain. Brain is dead. But in the mind, there are also propensities with which become associated some pictures. But they're really what we are experiencing. Also non-locality may enter, but these are actual collapse events where some pictures are generated. Where did these pictures come from? This is what you're asking, basically.
Right. What do you mean by pictures?
Well, hell is a picture.
Right.
Hell is a picture of suffering.
Yes.
So, what survives in a reincarnational event, quantum physical analysis shows that what survives are propensities, are just patterns of habit. The pictures are dead with the brain. The reason that we have pictures, this is very, very interesting. So the pictures must be gotten from non-local correlation with the previous birth. So in other words, we have a non-local window open through which we also experience the content of previous birth. Much of Ian Stevenson's data actually is the data about the content of experience, which are very different than the character of the experience. There are two things that are involved here. One is the content, and this content comes from direct non-local correlation of one birth with all the previous and all the future births also. There's non-local correlation between all of these births, so we are able to pick up snippets of content non-locally from the future and our past.
And this thread that connects various births, you have a word for that, is that?
Yes, it's called Sutratman in Sanskrit. And quantum monad is how I describe it, this thread. So this quantum monadic thread connects all of our previous births together and future births together. And we are non-locally capable of exchanging information, snippets of information, actual content. But there is also something that survives as our death, that can be called our character, the habit pattern that we pick up, the way we use our mind, the way we use our vital body. Those things also go with us after we die. And this is something that can be called to survive, because non-locality does not need the idea of survival. We are non-locally connected anyway. But what survives and can be picked up in the future, that question can be answered by saying what survives are these propensities. This is what ancient times was called soul. Soul does not have any content. It only has character, which Easterners call karma or samskara.
If consciousness creates matter, if consciousness creates life, then, according to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the point of life is to merge with the clear light and to get away from matter. Is that correct? Or to at least to not be reborn. Is there some kind of contradiction here? Why would consciousness invent a scenario in which one would want to escape?
Well, it depends on how.
Is that a legitimate question?
It is a very legitimate question, and I must say that this is a fundamental question that goes into the heart of what is the motivation of religion at this particular time.
Tell us what that is.
Well, in the olden days, there was a lot of suffering. Life was suffering. We didn't have escapes like we have today. If the weather was bad, you had to suffer through it. There is no central heating to protect you. Mm-hmm. If your mind is going through a difficult time because somebody has died, you have to suffer through it. There is very little distraction, particularly for a person who is not rich. Now there is, even for a fairly not rich person, there are many escapes available. So this absence of escapes made it so bad in terms of suffering. Religions basically identified life as suffering, and escape from this life made sense to people, and therefore to be liberated, even with the idea of reincarnation. Reincarnation mollified the idea a little bit, because one might say, well, okay, this is misery now, but in your next life, good things will happen, so be good, and maybe you can live for good things in the next life. So that mollifies the idea of suffering a little bit. But even then, basically, suffering was bad, and so people could be most inspired by saying there is a way to completely be liberated from this suffering, and so why not just try to liberate yourself from all this now? And achievement of samadhi and learning what you need to learn in this human birth, if you do that, then you will be liberated. And that idea is basically good. What we find scientifically is that perhaps such a learning journey is what human birth is about. And when we learn everything, we have nothing more to learn, we are liberated. That makes sense, right? So liberation was giving very high value at that time and in those societies. But now the situation has changed because we have discovered something else. This is still true. This liberation we still seek, and this liberation is still important. But in addition, what we have discovered is that we also evolve. There is also evolution. This evolution was missed in Buddha's time, in Jesus' time. We are not aware that we also evolve. What does evolution mean? Evolution means that at the same time as we are working towards personal salvation through many lives, we are working hard to purify ourselves and to take us to that liberated moment. In addition to that, whole of humanity is working hard to produce evolution in such a way that we evolve towards greater and greater states of goodness, states of divinity, states of godliness, states of love, as a whole species. The species itself will change into another species where love will be much more easily accessed. This supramental way of being has been predicted by two great Sava. One is Sri Aurobindo of India, the other is Teilhard de Chardin in the West. Will it happen? Well, new science is justifying it. New science says there is now a new theory of evolution. I have written another book which will come out in October called Creative Evolution. I made it much more explicit in that book, but there is a chapter even in God is Not Dead about this evolution. We now can understand evolution as evolution of consciousness in such a way that all the defects of Darwinism is gone, and we get a much more holistic picture of evolution, where there is purposiveness. We evolve with the purpose of becoming more and more loving, more and more into truth, more and more into beauty, more and more into justice. We live not only for our individual salvation in reincarnation, we also live because of this, we are part of the movement of consciousness towards evolution, where we evolve with our fellow members of our species.
Hence, your role as a quantum activist.
Hence my role as quantum activist, exactly, because no longer it is sufficient to work on your own persona and become liberated, but you must work with others, members of your own species, in order to evolve together. And this evolution together is important because that will, of course, improve the environment in which you live. It will help you also because when you come back and reincarnate, you have found that, world has improved greatly and it is easier now to work some of this stuff that I still have to work on.
Right. I think I understand now why you're so passionate about your work.
Thank you. Yes, I am passionate. And it is largely because I have recognized the importance of evolution in spirituality. This idea of evolutionary spirituality is coming to forth in rather strong way. Many other people are aware of this, and I think that it will become a very, very cogent movement in no time.
Last question. Dr. Goswami, how do you see the condition of humanity at this moment in time?
Well, the condition of humanity just at this moment is, of course, a little bit confused. Certainly, materialism has caused havoc with our belief systems that helped us becoming good, following ethics, following values. That is part of it. But the other part of it is very optimistic. Even within that malaise that has set in, there is a significant portion of us. Some people call them cultural creatives. A significant portion of us who is aware of the falsity of materialism, who are aware that the importance of God and godliness that has the possibility of scientific verification, who is aware of this new science coming about, and who are willing to be committed to change themselves and their societies. In other words, these are the people who are hearing the call of evolution. They are open to the movement of consciousness in the sense that they can feel the evolutionary pressure enough to give up their comfortable life and engage in quantum activism. And that is something that I feel very optimistic about. So we are confused. Materialism has produced some malaise. Problems have occurred. Global warming and terrorism, democracy is going away, and capitalism is not working anymore. It's very easy to be pessimistic today. Just look at the stock market, housing market. You can be very pessimistic. But I don't feel pessimistic because I constantly meet people also who are completely aware that this is a temporary phase brought about by misunderstanding that often happens in search of creativity. We make mistakes, and so we go through a phase which people call dark night of the soul in spiritual traditions. And we feel that this dark night is almost over, and we are the ones who are experiencing, who are actually seeing the early light of the new dawn. And then it's not so bad anymore. Actually, to tell you the truth, it looks very good and optimistic from here.
Dr. Goswami, I'd like to thank you very much for your insight, for your wonderful books, and for the movies you've appeared in. I think you've given us great gifts to think about. For that, I thank you, and I think the audience will thank you very much. So thank you for being on the show.
Thank you so much, Pal.
In the new paradigm you are building, quantum physics plays a major role. Could you talk to us about this?
Yes, actually this idea that there is a source of causality in the universe, apart from material causality. This idea differentiates spiritual traditions from materialists from the get-go. Every spiritual tradition has a concept of what can be summarized by the phrase downward causation. In this, material causation is upward, from elementary particles to atoms to molecules to cells to brain, and brain makes everything that we are, like our consciousness. This is upward causation, cause rising upward from elementary particles. You can think of the spiritual tradition's downward causation as a nice opposition to this. So we'll keep the phrase, but let it not evoke the idea that we are talking about a majestic God in the outer space that is doling out act of downward causation. That picture is not implicit in this phrase or in this phrasing.
Right. Talk to us about the struggle between spirituality and science.
Be glad to. This is a very old struggle. Right before Descartes, there was indeed a struggle was so lopsided in favor of Christianity that it was impossible for a scientist to study the physical world without hindrance, without interference from the church. Descartes did a very smart thing. He divided reality into two parts, matter and mind. Mind is God's realm. Mind is the realm of the human being. Mind has free will in Descartes' construction. And matter then is the realm of science, where science applies. And scientists are free to look at matter without the hindrance from church. Church has its domain, scientists have their domain. In this way, Descartes tries to establish a truce. The truce took a while, but eventually it came about and it went on for quite a while. What happened, however, is that Newton's work was so successful in terms of finding the movement of matter. More and more scientists started feeling, and in the 18th century, Pierre-Simon de Laplace expressed this very well. He said, we don't need that particular hypothesis, meaning that particular hypothesis of God in terms of describing how matter and the universe works. And more people started feeling that they don't need that particular hypothesis in talking about even realms which were given to religion. This started with great force by the work of Darwin, who showed that in truth, animals are machines. This is considered even by Christianity. But we evolved from animals, according to Darwin's theory. So then we also are machines. So this separation of mind and matter cannot be maintained anymore in view of this Darwinist view of evolution. And so very soon, this was being voiced. And very soon, the view grew, especially, as I said, in the 1950s. The view grew that scientific materialism holds for everything in nature. Nature is materialistic. It's made of matter, only material interactions count, everything else is epiphenomenon. So it is true in general that scientists try to create a lot of confusion by attacking this, continuing to attack this straw God. God is a very simplistic notion of a majestic person sitting in a throne in outer space, doling out acts of downward causation. And it does sound ridiculous to any educated mind today. Except that, of course, there is a lot of sympathy for such a simplistic God in some fractions of our society. We call them fundamentalists or by other names, but that does not mean that when anybody talks about God, they are talking about this simplistic God. This simplistic God cannot be subject of scientific scrutiny. There's no need for that. Why are these scientists attacking it then? Because what has happened in the meantime, that there is now significant, very solid in fact, scientific data suggesting that there is a God which is scientific, quite sophisticated, philosophically and scientifically completely tenable. And it raises questions about the basic veracity of the scientific materialism that sciences use as their fundamental metaphysics. And it is causing, in my mind, in my opinion, a little scare in many scientists, and therefore this is a preemptive strike against the new discoveries that are being made in favor of God, a scientifically tenable God, not that simplistic God.
And what are those new scientific discoveries?
Well, we have found the three basic agreements that spiritual traditions have about the nature of God, irrespective of what picture you have, simplistic or not. And these three basic tenets are all scientific tenets. One is that there is, apart from material cause, material interactions, there is another source of causation in the world. Now, just for naming it, we just name it as downward causation without any picture about it, no simplistic picture, please. This is just to contrast it from upward causation of the materialist, because in materialist thinking, elementary particle interactions cause everything, all of the conglomerates that can be thought as cause moving up. Elementary particles make atoms, make molecules, make cells, make the brain, makes all of our subjective experiences. Cause move upwards from the elementary particles, which is the base level. Just to contrast it from upward causation, we call this new or old source of causation downward causation. So this every religion, every spiritual tradition should agree with. And we have absolutely convincing evidence that downward causation exists.
So in upward causation, consciousness is an epiphenomenon of matter?
Yes.
Whereas in downward causation,
consciousness is the basic ground level of reality, ground of being.
And what is the relationship between this consciousness and downward causation and matter?
Well, you require a little bit of quantum physics for understanding this clearly.
Tell us.
All right. Quantum physics says that objects are not determined things, as Newton thought. Instead, objects are quantum possibilities for consciousness to choose from. Now, if a consciousness is choosing quantum possibilities, actuality from quantum possibilities, then a specter can be raised that what is the nature of this consciousness? If it is material, then a paradox takes place. How? Well, elementary particles make atoms, make molecules, make cells, make brain, make consciousness. Put this in quantum language, then possible elementary particles make possible atom, make possible molecules, make possible cells, make possible brain, making possible consciousness. How can possible consciousness looking at possible elementary particles give you anything actual? So this is a specter and this is true. There's a paradox. How does one solve this quantum measurement paradox? So one of the wisdom is that leave consciousness out of the situation. Because if you say consciousness has a non-material component, as von Neumann suggested, then again a paradox. How does a non-material entity interact with a material entity? It requires exchange of signals which carry energy, but energy of anything that is physical, energy of the physical universe, is always a constant. Energy never comes into the physical universe from any other universe, nor does energy go out of the physical universe to any other universe. So dualism, this philosophy which is called dualism, is not a tenable philosophy, not a scientifically tenable philosophy. So either way you look at consciousness, If you look at consciousness as material, you get a paradox. If you look at consciousness as non-material, you get a paradox. So the idea was very, very confusing. How can our looking produce actual events of experience, convert the possibilities and actual events of experience, and this just creates a knot of thought which has been very difficult for scientists to solve. 2 decades ago, this problem was solved by recognizing that there is another way of thinking of consciousness, and this is consciousness as the ground of all being. This is esoteric tradition of spirituality, not the popular tradition, but this thought is there in the esoteric tradition since millennia. The thought was rediscovered in the context of quantum measurement problem because it solves the paradoxes. How? If you think of consciousness as the ground of being and material possibilities are possibilities within that consciousness, then consciousness can choose one of the facets of the possibility and make it into an actual event of experience, but this does not involve dualism because consciousness is choosing from itself one of its own facets. Does not require any interaction, does not fall into the paradox of dualism. So it's a nice, neat solution. And when you look into the details of consciousness in this way, we find the neatness even expressed even better. This consciousness is a non-ordinary state of our consciousness, not the ordinary state of our consciousness where we feel individual, but instead, this consciousness is non-local. It's not individual, it's cosmic.
What do you mean by non-local?
Non-local means, for all future references, a communication that does not require energy producing signals, energy involving signals. A signal-less communication, that is non-locality. It's an interconnectedness which does not require any signal to produce communications within it.
Must there be space and time for this to work?
No, this is outside of space and time. That is the crucial point. In space and time, as Einstein showed a long time ago, this is part of his theory of relativity. In space and time, every communication requires a signal that carries energy. This is outside of space and time. So this way of thinking, in fact, quantum physics in this way requires that there is reality outside of space and time.
Dr. Goswami, talk to us about subtle bodies and the evidence for them.
What are subtle bodies? Subtle bodies are called subtle because we experience them differently than we experience the material bodies, which are called gross. Material bodies, we see ourselves separate. We see material bodies as external to us, whereas subtle bodies, we experience them internally. We have experiences of feeling, we have experiences of thinking, we even have experiences that are so subtle, we call them intuition, and we debate as to their nature. We don't quite know what they are. But as the psychologist Carl Jung has codified, we really do have these 4 domains of experience. Sensing for the outside objects that we call material, then feeling. We feel energies, but these are not physical energies. These are called vital energies. We feel energies at different parts of our body that Easterners call chakra. Along the meridian, there are 7 major chakras that people today are very familiar, and we feel feelings there. Then there is the mind and associated thinking. We have the experience of thinking, and as I said, very subtle experience of intuition. What do we intuit? We intuit archetypes, to use the language of Plato. Archetypes such as truth, beauty, justice, love, and good. So 4 kinds of experience, 4 kinds of possibilities in consciousness. When consciousness chooses from this possibility, the actuality brings about an experience of sensing, if it's a material actuality. If it is a vital energy actuality, then that would be the feeling of energy, vital energy. If it is a thought that is coming into experience, that would be a mental experience of meaning. And if it is the intuition that we are experiencing, then that would be, the object would be a supramental archetype. So in this way, the subtle bodies can be defined very clearly. And if a materialist says, materialists have two objections against this. Well, one is dualism. Dualism is that old objection, how does a non-material body interact with a material body? And what they say is that since such interaction is impossible, therefore these non-material bodies have to be material. They don't deny the experience, they only say that, well, they have to have material origin. But quantum physics shows that dualism now can be bypassed, because how do these objects interact? Well, they interact not directly, but through the intermediary of non-local consciousness. Consciousness uses non-locality, which does not involve any signals. And therefore, the argument about dualism, the paradox of dualism, is completely avoided. Quantum physics allows us that. So that old dualistic argument against Descartes' idea of mind separate from matter has already been removed. And one shouldn't be afraid of scientists because of their argument of dualism. And again, are these things material? For example, is thought, mind, is this non-material? Or can material brain explain thoughts? This is a very important point, and scientists again have made huge progress in this regard. When artificial intelligence research came about because of the advent of computers, one of the things people tried to do is to produce intelligent computers. And indeed, in the 80s, you could call up a number in Canada and you could talk to a California psychiatrist, quote unquote, with the touchy-feely psychobabble of the day. Later to find out that you were talking to a computer program. But John Searle, a philosopher, and Roger Penrose, a physicist, they showed conclusively that this does not tell you the whole story. Yes, a computer can fool you with content, which is programmed into the computer. But there is something more than content in a thought. Just as a sentence has syntax and semantics, two aspects, similarly, a thought has content, but also meaning. And the meaning level is impossible to process with a computer, which is a symbol processing machine. So in this way, the proof is now very mathematical and very definite that a computer cannot process meaning. If a computer cannot process meaning, and brain is a computer, then brain cannot process meaning either. What processes meaning? Mind processes meaning. What is the brain's job? Brain makes representation of mental meaning, just as a computer makes representation of mental meaning that we give to the computer. So in this way, we are now beginning to understand the nature of the subtle bodies better also. So are there evidence for these subtle bodies? Is there evidence for the mind being affecting our lives and so forth? Yes, there's tremendous evidence. In the past few decades, we have had very solid evidence. First of all, mind itself. If we give wrong mental meaning to some of our experiences, it can be so severe that it can produce disease of the physical body. And when we correct the mental meaning, then indeed the physical body is back to healing. It heals itself. So in this way, the evidence is now very, very clear. But even more solid evidence comes from the phenomenon of reincarnation. In reincarnation, we find evidence that although the physical body dies, but the subtle bodies live on in a sense that they can be reincarnated later in some future physical body. How do we know that this is a reincarnation of a previous body? This is where Ian Stevenson, a University of Virginia psychiatrist, has done enormously useful research. He has shown that children often remember stories and anecdotes, episodes from their past lives. What Stevenson has done, he has verified some of these stories. He has taken them seriously, and he has verified some of these stories. And some of them are so striking that you just have to agree that there is something here that cannot be explained away. I'll give you an example. There was a little girl who was having reincarnational memory of a nearby village where she lived in the past life. Now, this girl is born of a poor family, so she had never been to that village. But when Stevenson heard this story, she said, okay, I'll take you there. Let's see what you can remember, if you can find the house and all this. So they went, and after a while, the girl was able to identify a house. This is the house she lived. And then she remembered something, that there is a hidden compartment in the house. In that hidden compartment, there is some money. So Stevenson went into the house, took the permission from the present owners, and indeed they found the hidden compartment, just as the girl described how to find it. And in that hidden compartment, there is money. And guess what? The money is actually the old money that would correspond, completely authenticate the girl's story. So in this way, and you have to really read, Stevenson collected some 2,000 case histories like this. And every one of them he verified directly by going into the place where the memory was about and all this. The details are so wonderfully checked out and so thoroughly carried out that once you look at this data, you cannot doubt reincarnation anymore.